Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, what is the meaning of the Buddha's teaching of mind only? Is all reality merely an illusion projected onto my experience by my storehouse consciousness, based on my karma?
That is a complicated question. It might be that reality is such a projection, but I don't think that we should assume it is being projected onto a blank and empty screen. That is to say, when you experience a sunset, I think the sun and earth are there. How you experience that sunset, be it good, bad, or neutral, could be due to your karma. But the sun's presence is not due to your karma.
Fascinating. So if experience is being projected or perfumed by my mind for me to cognize it, then does that mean that there is a capital S self?
I don't think so. Just because experience is a projection does not mean that that projection is being perceived by a capital S self. Rather, the karmic nature of that experience contributes to the ongoing karmic momentum of the storehouse consciousness, and that explains your continued arising in the world.
So it's a cycle, I see. Where does this teaching come from? The Buddha himself?
Interestingly, no. It comes from one of his disciples, Vasubandhu.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing Vasubandhu. Who was Vasubandhu? What were some of his views? How did he affect Buddhism in East Asia? We hope you enjoy. So, who was Vasubandhu?
Vasubandhu was a very influential Buddhist monk and scholar from Gandhara. This is a region in present-day northwest Pakistan. He is thought to have been born somewhere in the 4th to 5th century Common Era, and he's actually half-brothers with Asanga, another very influential Buddhist thinker who will get his own episode soon. Vasubandhu is credited as one of the founding figures of Yogacara Buddhism, and a lot of the mind-only thought, the Dharma theory, and the causality theory that we discuss on the show can be attributed to him and to his commentaries. Incidentally, much of what we are discussing in the Lankavatara Sutra episodes can be attributed to his work as well, as the Lankavatara Sutra is very important for both Chan and Yogacara. Early in their history, the sectarian distinctions between Chan and Yogacara that we can identify now simply were not there, so much of Vasubandhu's work is highly influential on both schools of Buddhism. Much of the information we have about his life comes from 3 biographies that were written about him by 3 different monks in 3 different places and times. The first biography was by Paramartha, an Indian monk who lived from 499 to 569 CE. Next we have one from Xuanzang, a Chinese monk who lived from 602 to 664. Finally, we have one from a Tibetan monk called Buton Rinchen Drup, who lived from 1290 to 1364. According to these 3 sources, Vasubandhu was initially a Sarvastivada Buddhist monk. If you remember, Sarvastivada Buddhism is also called the Abhidharma school, and they center their study around those texts rather than the sutras. When we talked about the Tripitaka in episode 49, which will be linked in the show notes, we mentioned how Abhi in Abhidharma can translate to concerning the Dharma or around the Dharma, but it can also mean the highest teaching of the Dharma or the quintessential Dharma. The latter definition is the one championed by the Sarvastivadins. So it's clear that Vasubandhu came up in a strong scholarly tradition surrounding study of the Abhidharma texts in particular, and this will lead to him creating vast commentaries on those texts which will become highly influential on Yogacara and Chan doctrine. After studying with the Sarvastivadins for a while, he came to question their teachings and lean more toward a Sautrantika viewpoint. The Sautrantika Buddhists represent a response to the Sarvastivadins' extreme emphasis on the Abhidharma texts. Sautrantika thinkers argue that the Abhidharma texts ought to be interpreted in the context of the sutras, because those are the words of the Buddha himself, and the Abhidharma texts are not. The Sautrantika school strongly emphasizes the superiority of Buddha Vachana, or the direct words of the Buddha. As I said, the Abhidharma texts are generally not thought to be the words of the Buddha while he was alive, but are the words of Buddhist thinkers from during and after his life. However, because of Vasubandhu's proclivity for both the Sarvastivadin and the Sautrantika points of view, it's safe to say that he was a leading scholar monk on the sutras and on the Abhidharma texts during his life. Further on in his monastic career, due in part to the influence of his brother Asanga, Vasubandhu converted to Mahayana Buddhism and began authoring treatises on mind-only discourse that would eventually be the seed for Yogacara Buddhism and would exert strong influences on other forms of Mahayana Buddhism such as Chan, Pure Land, Huayan, and more. He authored the 20 verses on consciousness only, known in Sanskrit as the Vimshatika Vijnapta Matrata Siddhi, and its commentary, as well as the 30 verses on consciousness only, the Trimsika Vijnapti Matrata Siddhi. These texts were translated and commented upon for millennia to come. They are probably some of the most popular and important texts in Buddhism that are not canonical and are not Buddha Vachana. These works that Vasubandhu authored came to be quite controversial in his time, and he gained a lot of notoriety for the waves they caused. He was said to have been invited to tutor or lecture to Chandragupta, one of the kings of the Gupta dynasty, and he is also said to be an avid debater and lecturer. He traveled all around India and parts of Central Asia, sharing his mind-only thesis, among other ideas, and gathering a following of people who would eventually be the first Yogacara Buddhists. His ability to defeat Brahmanical philosophers in debate and his charisma as a tutor and lecturer led Chandragupta to become his patron, giving him funds to build monasteries and get Yogacara Buddhism started. The main reason he was so controversial is that mind-only doctrine, which was likely first presented in the Samdhi-Nirmochana Sutra, is the subject of a great deal of debate among the Sarvastivada, Sautrantika, and Yogacara Buddhists. During Vasubandhu's life, these comparatively young sects were still struggling among and between themselves to settle on doctrinal issues like mind-only in a post-Sakyamuni world. And things became more contentious once Vasubandhu took his very radical and synthetic perspective on it. This view came from the Abhidharma texts, the sutras, and also a genre of texts called sastras, which are academic treatises which serve as doctrinal instruction manuals. Initially, the sutras present the idea of mind-only rather cursorily, and then the sastras and the Abhidharma texts make various attempts to explain how they could actually work, how it relates to other doctrines, and how it can possibly be resolved against other contradictory things the Buddha allegedly said. Textually speaking, the time in which Vasubandhu came up was incredibly chaotic. For some context around this chaos, the first generation of schools includes 4 major groupings that formed after the Buddhist councils, known as Sthaviravada, Vibhajivada, Sarvastivada, and Mahasamgika. However, in the 3rd through 5th centuries Common Era, these schools were all competing, and their disciples were going off and founding their own schools based on differences in interpretation of particular texts and doctrines, which, I might add, were still being put down in writing based on 700 to 1,000 years of oral traditions that reach all the way back to the Buddha himself. Today, Sthaviravada and Mahasamgika have mostly died out. Vibhajivada led to the development of Theravada and others, while Sarvastivada led to Sautrantika and Yogacara. So, it's clear Vasubandhu was a pivotal figure during an impactful time in Buddhism's history.
What were some of his views?
Here, I will explain the radical synthetic mind-only view that I mentioned earlier. In our everyday minds, we have this idea that there is the internal world, where all of our thinking and feeling goes on, and an external world, where the things that we perceive with our senses go on. Where do feelings, internal monologues, and new ideas happen? Internally. Where do sunrises, car accidents, and podcasts happen? Externally. However, due to non-self and non-duality, there can be no such distinction, because it assumes that the boundaries of the capital S self separate the internal and external world, and Buddhism teaches that there is no capital S self. So, where do all the things I just mentioned actually happen? This is a seemingly stupid question, but it is almost impossible to actually answer. When stuff happens, it can't be in internal reality or external reality because that is an illusory distinction. If we remove the modifiers of internal and external, we could try to say it happens in reality. But that doesn't work either, because that assumes some sort of substantial and enduring existence, either of reality itself, as a foundation for all things to occur, or of the things happening themselves. This is not possible either due to impermanence and emptiness. Non-self applies to all things, and impermanence means that things are transient and ever-changing. So Vasubandhu's conclusion is that nothing exists at all except within our storehouse consciousnesses, our alaya vijnana. This is where our thoughts, feelings, emotions, beliefs, and the foundations of our behaviors come from. But Vasubandhu argues that this is also where all of our purported quote-unquote external experiences come from. This is no base or foundation for those phenomena that our senses perceive. We think that cognition is a process of phenomenon, sensation, perception, recognition, memory forming, habit forming. But actually, it is the exact reverse. Our karmic momentum, built up from all of the actions and behaviors that we have done over all of our rebirths, causes our habits to take form. Those cause our memories to take form. Those cause our recognition to take form, and on, all the way even to the phenomenon itself. Our karmic momentum is the cause for the phenomenon we purport to experience. This is verging on a solipsistic, brain being beamed images point of view, but solipsism requires a brain or a self for images to be beamed to, and non-self prevents that as well. The fact that shared experience is such a sticking point for mind-only doctrine serves as another reason that it cannot accurately be regarded as solipsism. Solipsism would require that no other people, alaya vijnanas, aggregates, or whatever you like to call them, would exist. They too would only be projections that are being beamed onto the brain or the mind. Crucially, mind-only doctrine struggles to make sense of shared experiences. In Vasubandhu's system, it should be difficult and rare for people to have such similar karmic momentums or profiles that their alaya vijnana projects the same experience to them at the same time. His explanation for this is that nobody actually experiences the exact same thing at the same time because their perceptions and experiences will necessarily be different. But they're close enough to appear to be similar to the untrained eye. This is fine if 1 to 3 people witness an event, but it doesn't hold up for huge events. For example, if 100,000 people attend a concert, there are certainly 100,000 different, unique individual experiences going on in the audience, but they all hear the same lyrics and the same melodies. There's enough shared experience, enough stuff that is the same between all of them, to weaken this idea that all alaya vijnanas are projecting different things onto reality for the consciousness to experience. Vasubandhu himself disavows this notion, acknowledging that there are other consciousnesses out there that aren't projections of my own consciousness, but he does not provide a strong alternative. Vasubandhu's view on mind only is perhaps the most extreme explanation of mind only up to the point of his life. Up to that point, it was thought that there was indeed an external reality where stuff happened, but how it was perceived was dependent on one's karma. So, when Vasubandhu comes around with his view, especially when he makes a pretty solid case from quoting sutras, sastras, and Abhidharma texts, it shakes things up. Another of his important mind-only contributions is the idea of the 3 natures, or the 3 svabhavas, which we have seen in the Lankavatara Sutra. These 3 are the fabricated nature, known in Sanskrit as parikalpita, the dependent nature, paratantra, and the absolute nature, paranishpanna. These are essentially 3 modes into which the emergence of experience can be placed. The fabricated nature, or the contrived nature as it's sometimes called, refers to everyday experience, watching the movie projected onto the blank screen by the alaya vijnana. The dependent nature refers to the causal processes that lead to that experience, such as karma, causes, and conditions. The absolute nature refers to that which is expressed by the concept of suchness. Remember that suchness is the totality of the capital D Dharma as can be understood through the singular small d Dharma. This is a thing's absolute nature. This absolute nature can be likened to a divine nature, as in Abrahamic religions. Finally, we can look at his analysis of small d dharmas, things in reality. To answer the question of how karma works in his system, he proposes that all of the projections of the alaya vijnana are simultaneously seeds and fruits, also rendered as causes and effects. An event itself is the effect of a cause, which was itself planted by an effect of a cause, and so on and so on. These seeds and their fruits are either karmically good, bad, or neutral, and this is categorically locked. Bad seeds cause bad fruits and cannot cause any other kind of fruit. Similarly, bad fruits plant bad seeds and no other kind. To answer the question of what events are good, bad, or neutral, Vasubandhu attempted to categorize all experiences accordingly, listing off 75 different small d dharmas. Each of these feelings or experiences is described and listed as karmically good, bad, or neutral. Some karmic bads from his list are doubt, sloth, arrogance, fraud, etc. Some karmic neutrals are attention, decision, concentration, and sensation. Some karmic goods are faith, equanimity, decorum, non-violence, non-greediness, and non-ill will.
How does this relate to the Vimalakirti Sutra, where we have seen things that are typically held to be karmically bad be reframed as having an enlightening nature? If I recall correctly, those ideas come chronologically after this?
This is a very good and important question. The Vimalakirti Sutra was actually authored around 100 CE, so that would be 300 or 400 years before the life of Vasubandhu. But it was then regarded as a nirdesa, not as a sutra. In layman's terms, a nirdesa is just some advice given by some guy, so it's not regarded as canonical until Buddhism arrived and developed in China. To answer your first question, the issue of what is karmically good and bad gets significantly reframed and reimagined in later Mahayana Buddhism. Vasubandhu lived and worked at the crucial bridging point between early Buddhism, which has now developed into Theravada, and Mahayana. Thus, Yogacara carries characteristics of both. One of the older characteristics that it inherits from earlier Buddhism is this moral absolutism. It is actually not until a lot of Mahayana thinkers begin to read and refer to the Vimalakirti Sutra in China that Mahayana Buddhism really starts to challenge strictly dualistic good and bad that we see in older Buddhism. Also, when Vimalakirti is speaking about karmically bad things being potentially enlightening, he is speaking from the perspective of the bodhisattva ideal. And in that ideal, a bodhisattva would not himself drink or gamble or sleep around. But he would be so enlightened already on account of following the bodhisattva path that he could hang around with people who do this and not be worried about temptation and desire. This is responding to a Lotus Sutra notion of bodhisattvas, wherein they have to be sheltered and protected from the world of the passions, and can only go out with a friend who is there to make sure that they don't succumb to worldly indulgences.
How did Vasubandhu affect Buddhism in East Asia?
In founding Yogacara and in innovating doctrines and interpretations that went on to influence major schools of Buddhism, it's safe to say that Vasubandhu is a titan of Buddhist history. He's one of the earlier Buddhist figures that we can positively be sure existed historically, and he is a major figure who shaped Chinese Buddhism, which was predominantly influenced by Yogacara and Chan. This is the case even though he did not himself translate from Sanskrit or Pali into Chinese, nor did he author his texts in Chinese. He instead authored in Sanskrit. He is found in many lineages of different schools of Buddhism. For example, he's the 21st patriarch of Chan, the second patriarch of Jodo Shinshu Pure Land in Japan, and one of the 17 Nalanda masters of Nalanda University, a medieval Buddhist monastery in modern-day Bihar. Interestingly, because of how prolific he was during his life, there was a theory that the name Vasubandhu actually referred to two people of the same name, one who is a Sarvastivadin and one who is a member of the Sautrantika school. The argument is that the views espoused by Vasubandhu during his time as a Sarvastivadin and his views from when he was affiliated with the Sautrantika school are too different, and that these must be two guys who were collapsed down into one over time. However, this theory is almost entirely rejected nowadays for a few reasons. One reason is that we have identified texts in both the Sautrantika and Sarvastivada canons that were previously attributed to anonymous authors that we find are actually written by Vasubandhu. Additionally, the two Vasubandhu's theory assumes that Vasubandhu's views in his early writings are just too different from his later works to possibly be the same guy. However, textual analysis shows that texts attributed to him make use of such similar form, syntax, style, and vocabulary that they can't possibly be authored by two separate people. What we have here is somebody whose views change sharply over time. This happens sometimes. There are many other examples of founders in Buddhist schools developing and changing throughout their lives, taking strongly opposing views toward stuff they used to champion.
This is also a thing that we can observe happening in real life as well, like today. For example, once upon a time, I thought capitalism was a pretty cool system that made things go well, and I very much don't anymore. People change their minds.
Exactly. Historically, people try to interpret singular coherent through lines in the works and opinions of important founding figures, but this is because that figure has become holy and they've become an object of worship. Vasubandhu was a person, and so it would be entirely plausible for his views to change and for him to disavow stuff he used to believe in.
So, that concludes this week's discussion of Vasubandhu. We hope you enjoyed. Join us next week, where we will be discussing the history of anti-Buddhist thought in Japan. What is the history of anti-Buddhist thought in Japan? What is its social and political context? What is the state of Buddhism in Japan today? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Thank you to Tanner, Wooly, and Adine for backing us on Patreon. We really appreciate your support. Just a quick reminder, the Patreon page for Bright on Buddhism will be shutting down at the end of this month, November 2024. We have made a statement about why on the Patreon page. You can find that at patreon.com/brightonbuddhism. Thank you. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.